Economics lecture series. If you're here for CLE credit, make sure to sign up on the form at the back of the room so that we can make sure you get that. Today, we're going to have Anna Marhold speaking with us. We'll have time for about 10 minutes of questions at the end, so if you could hold your questions until then. Anna is assistant professor at the Institute of Public Law and the Grotius Center for International Legal Studies at Leiden University. Her specializations are international and European energy law and regulation, international economic law, and international trade law. In 2015, she was a Marie Curie Early Stage Research Fellow in the framework of dispute settlement in trade, training in law and economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. In 2013 and 14, she was an EU-US Fulbright Schumann grantee and visiting scholar at the NYU School of Law. She holds a PhD in law from the European University Institute in Florence, and this is her second year teaching global energy law and policy in our summer session here at VLS. Her talk today is called Externalizing Europe's Energy Policy in the EU Free Trade Agreements. I'd like to have you welcome Professor Anna Marhold.
So thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be back at Vermont Law School. It's always a pleasure to see this beautiful, really wild nature, something we don't have in the Netherlands. It simply doesn't exist. So thank you, and it's a pleasure to teach here. I have great students in the class. I will be discussing with you today my upcoming article, which basically discusses EU's external energy policy and what I call kind of a cognitive dissonance in the way the EU behaves with regard to fossil fuels and renewable energy. And basically, I want to start out, last time I had this talk, I started out with Trump. And this time, unfortunately, I will start out again with Trump, but not only with Trump. I will also start out with Juncker. So here we see Juncker, which is the president of the European Commission, and Donald Trump saying, we made a deal today, back in 2018. They made a deal about increasing LNG gas supplies from the US to Europe. Now, as you may or may not know, there was an export ban on fossil fuels in place in the United States up until 2015. So up until 2015, the US, under US law, was not allowed to export fossil fuels to third countries. Now, that ban has been lifted, especially with the discovery of shale gas supplies in the US, and so the US has become a net exporter of fossil fuels, and Europe is very much interested in those fossil fuels. Hence, Juncker and Trump here. And since the first cargo of April 2016, US LNG exports to Europe have been increasing substantially, and in July 2018, you do see that there is an increase of 272% of LNG exports to Europe. It's the highest recorded volume ever in EU-US trade in LNG, with more than 1.4 billion cubic meters. Now, there is more. There is also Trump lashes Germany over gas pipeline, calls it Russia's captive. Now, you might remember that a year ago, Trump was in Europe talking to Angela Merkel, and one of the criticisms he had was basically saying, you, Germany, you are being hypocrite because you're posing sanctions on Russia on the one hand, but on the other hand, you are also very keen to have a second Nord Stream pipeline bringing gas from Russia straight into the EU, namely to Germany. Actually, now there's talk of sanctions being brought on that pipeline. What is this pipeline? So this is a huge pipeline running from Vyborg in Russia to Greifswald in Germany. And there's already one of the Nord Stream pipelines in existence. It's a pipeline of 1,200 kilometers. I don't know exactly what that would be in miles, but about 1,200 kilometers running through the Baltic Sea, bringing gas directly from Russia to the EU. Now, the first pipeline went into operation about 10 years ago. It was already a controversial project back then. It's operated by the Nord Stream company, which has shareholders of Gazprom, 51%, and a mix of EU energy companies on the other hand. And it's located, registered in Switzerland. Now, this pipeline was controversial, but back when it first became operational, there was not a comprehensive strategy on how to deal with gas pipelines from third countries. So up until very recently, there was not a coherent regulation or rules-based system for import pipelines from third countries into the EU. Now, since then, there has been special energy package legislation in place that actually imposes unbundling, which I've been bothering my students with here very intensively. So the energy sector in the EU has to be unbundled and uncoupled. And it basically means that the EU would like suppliers from abroad, from third countries, to also unbundle their activities when they enter the EU market. Now, there's talk of the second pipeline. It's already in place. It was heavily criticized, this second pipeline. And the reason why is because it's even more increasing the capacity of gas being transported from Russia to the EU, bypassing crucial transit countries in Eastern Europe, such as Ukraine, for instance. And for those of you, some of you might have heard that there were transit disputes in the early 2000s between Russia and the Ukraine, which disrupted gas supplies to Europe altogether. So this pipeline is controversial because it would even increase the volumes of Russian gas to Europe, bypassing these countries, you could say giving Russia even more power with regard to gas relations towards those countries, and having a line straight to Germany. Since this spring, the EU Commission has agreed upon new directive with regard to gas regulation of import pipelines. And it means that for the first time in history, the EU will have a coherent legal framework dealing with import pipelines from third countries. So not only from Russia, but also from, for instance, North Africa entering the European Union. So if you build new pipelines, those have to abide by EU regulations. So it is true that there is a lot of conflict in Europe. You have some EU member states that are very much in favor of Russian gas, such as Germany. But there are other EU member states who are very worried about relying on Russian gas too much. And those are especially the former communist new member states of the European Union. So there was a lot of opposition to the second pipeline, especially from those countries, especially Poland and the Baltic states. And before it came into being, it was a huge hassle. Trump is not happy about that pipeline and actually is now threatening Merkel with pipeline sanctions on that pipeline. So you can ask yourself, why does he want to do that? Well, the reasons for that are threefold. First of all, you could say it's nice in connection with the existing sanctions that are already existing on Russia in connection with the annexation of the Crimea. So it is kind of a three birds hit with one stone, two birds with one stone type of thing where you will hit Russia there right away, but you will also hit the EU. Why does Trump want to hit the EU? Well, first of all, it's about the NATO budget. So he wants to have an increased spending of the EU to the budget of NATO, but also trade concessions. So you do know that there's, of course, you would say, a trade war going on also between the EU and the US with regards to tariffs on steel and aluminum, for instance. And Trump has a, let's say, Trump card here in place where he can try and pressure the EU for some other concessions, for some trade concessions. And moreover, it's a great way to boost LNG supplies from the US towards Europe and making Europe shift away only from Russian gas. So what I've been talking about now until now is basically that Europe is quite keen on the use of fossil fuels in general. So what you see that Europe is very, if not the most dependent continent globally on the import of fossil fuels. You see, of course, that there is also in Southeast Asia some countries that are heavily dependent on fossil fuel imports. But if you look at the EU, we are heavily dependent on imports of fossil fuels, petroleum and natural gas from abroad. Where does that come from? It usually comes from the Gulf and from Russia, and will now in the future from the United States. Here you can see how import dependent on Russia some of the Eastern European Union countries are. So you can see basically that the former communist countries that are now new EU member states, a lot of them are dependent on Russia for its natural gas for more than 75%. So in addition to guaranteeing energy security, this is a huge political tool as well. And it does imply that these countries are afraid, I would say, of Russia with regard to the supply of gas and the power Russia has in that respect. So, although I don't agree with Trump's policies at all, I would say that when he says that Germany is dependent on Russian gas, that is the truth. It is true that Europe is maneuvering and behaving in, let's say, a bit of an erratic way sometimes, and it has to balance constantly between political issues, but also between energy security. Yeah? So Germany does play a very important role in Europe, and it also has, of course, interests with regard to energy security here. So it does want to ensure that it has this gas. That's why I kind of call it a cognitive dissonance. So in the field of psychology, a cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort experienced by a person who holds two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values. And I would say the way Europe behaves in its external energy policy is a constant balance, and you could argue that to a certain extent there's some cognitive dissonance going on there. So for instance, we want to be the front runners with regard to renewable energy and energy efficiency. Ooh, but on the other hand, we are the continent that's the most dependent on fossil fuel imports, and we have to make sure that our relationships with huge energy importers are also good. Yeah? So it's contradictory, and you could see that Europe constantly has to balance between these objectives and these beliefs. So the question is whether we are looking here at comforting lies or unpleasant truths. So the unpleasant truth is that Europe is extremely dependent on fossil fuel imports. I wouldn't say the renewable energy targets are a comforting lie. Europe is progressive and is working towards them, but we can't discard the fact that we're not there yet, and a lot has to happen for Europe to become energy secure and energy independent. I'm talking a little bit about competences, namely the competences between the European Union and its member state. Such as we are not a federation, we are not a country, but we have, I would say, compared to US legislation, much more federal-like top-down regulations and directives that are binding upon EU member states. There are exclusive competences in place. This means that the European Union can legislate exclusively in particular areas since 2007 and the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. And these exclusive competences mean that it's only the EU that can basically make treaties and set policies in this area. One of these competences is common commercial policy. So everything that regards to international trade agreements would be an exclusive competence of the EU. So it's now the European Union as such that will negotiate trade agreements with third countries. Well, previously you would have a Germany-US trade agreement, for instance. It would now be the EU free trade agreement with, let's say, Singapore, the CETA with Canada, and so on. It's an exclusive competence. It's important to note that between the competences between the EU and the member states, the basic principles are laid down in Article 5 on the Treaty on the Functioning of the Treaty on the European Union. And it means that the EU also has to always behave in a manner that is proportionate. It means that the content of and scope of EU action may not go beyond what is necessary to achieve the objectives of the treaties. And it's also subsidiary. So the EU should act only and insofar as the objective of a proposed action cannot be sufficiently achieved by the EU countries, but could be better achieved at EU level. In practice, we see that we generally think a lot of policies can be better achieved at EU level. So, for instance, with regard to energy policy, the EU will set the tone, and the member states will legislate and make policy there where the EU hasn't done so. If we look at EU energy policy, so how energy policy is made on the Union level, we look into Article 194 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And there you can basically see, it's important to know that it's not an exclusive competence, but it's a shared competence, which means that both the Union and the member states separately can make policy and legislate in this area. But it's usually the Union that will set the general tone, and the member states that can then legislate and make policy there where the Union hasn't done so. This is a new competence. It's only been taken up in the Treaty of Lisbon. So since 2009, there is an energy-specific competence in the EU. And it basically says that Union policy on energy shall aim in a spirit of solidarity between member states to ensure the functioning of the energy market, ensure the security of supply of the Union, promote energy efficiency and the development of renewables, and promote the interconnection of energy networks. However, it's also important to know in paragraph 2 that such measures shall not affect a member state's right to determine the conditions for exploiting its energy resources, its choice between different energy resources, and the general structure of its energy supply without prejudice to Article 192, which is an environmental article. So it basically says that the type of energy mix separate member states choose to have remains within the competences of the member states. So what type of energy mix you want to have, it's very difficult for the Union to interfere with that other than setting renewable energy targets, for instance, with regard to environmental policy. So this already says that energy sector issues largely were traditionally very much within the member states, and the EU can only legislate in areas that would be for union-wide purposes. Energy security plays a huge role in EU energy policy. However, energy security as such is an undefined concept. There is no legal definition on the EU level or internationally what energy security actually means. We can agree that it usually has 3 elements. So this would be the International Energy Agency, and that would say that it concerns a reliable, uninterruptible supply, an affordable, competitive supply, and an accessible and available supply. You can also distinguish between long-term and short-term energy security. So long-term energy security means that your systems are secure enough to deal with changes in the future and ensure that they're also sustainable. And short-term energy security means that your systems have to be able to absorb shocks, such as gas disruptions, blackouts, etc., that deal with energy security. But no legal definition of energy security exists. If we look at the internal energy market, it's basically a convergence of 2 policy areas. First of all, competition policy. So making sure competition policy extends also to the energy sector in Europe, but also to have a EU-wide energy policy and beyond. So it's not only in the EU, but also with regard to third countries. There has been market liberalization in stages. So because energy markets were so nationally focused, there was almost no cross-border trade across the European Union. And so the EU has introduced legislation to break up the markets and ensure that they are competitive. Most recently in 2009, there was the Third Energy Directive, which forced unbundling of production, transmission, and supply of energy. And now in 2019, we are entering a new era where we are trying to, for instance, introduce flexibility to the energy market and ensure that prosumers can also enter the market. So those are phases of liberalization of the European energy market. So that's the internal element. What about the external element of EU energy policy? So there's no exclusive competence for the EU to act externally. So you have to imply that if you have the competences to act internally, that you can also act externally. So with regard to the energy competence that the EU has in Article 194, they can also enter into treaties with third parties outside of the EU on the basis of that. However, again, it's important to notice that member states remain competent to conclude international agreements that relate to the composition of their energy mix, and they cannot be preempted by any EU action from doing so. So again, you see this tension between the member states and the European Union as a whole. So that's the energy side of things. But on the other side, the EU also has these very ambitious renewable energy targets. And there's these 2020 and 2030 strategies that basically say that by 2030, 32% of all energy generated in the EU has to be from renewable energy sources. And there has to be a 40% of cuts in emissions. So it's not only about diversifying your supplies, but it's also that the EU really wants to be a front runner with regard to renewable energy on the global stage. So it has these ambitious targets, and it has also done so in the framework of the Paris Agreement. Wasn't 2015 just a great year? Brexit hadn't happened, Trump wasn't elected yet. It was like, you know, we lived in bliss back then compared to now, maybe, perhaps. But in any case, for those of you who don't know, the Paris Agreement has been one of the success stories in international climate negotiations. And it mandates a reduction of the global temperature and keep it within a range of a maximum increase of 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius maximum. How it works is that countries, instead of having mandatory targets, just as we had in the Kyoto Protocol, countries have to submit voluntary contributions on how they intend to meet those targets. And the EU has submitted an EU-wide nationally determined contribution where it does want to cut 40% of emissions by 2030. So in line with this, the EU has very ambitious renewable energy policies that not only internally but also wants to realize these externally in relations with their trading partners. The EU has also unveiled the Energy Union. So there is a very ambitious plan for the EU, not only to have an internal market, but to become a whole independent energy union focused on energy security, solidarity, and trust, working towards a fully integrated European energy market, making sure that gas and electricity markets are unbundled, competitive, and interconnected, contributing to energy efficiency and moderation of demand, focused on decarbonizing the economy, and investing in research and innovation and competitiveness in these sectors. So the EU has unveiled this plan in 2015 as a larger political strategy. And in the strategy, it has right away highlighted the fact that it's very dependent on Russia and that it's an unreliable neighbor with regard to energy relations, and that it should diversify away. And that's where the United States, of course, come in as a more reliable energy supplier. I will now move to free trade agreements because we are looking to how this all plays out in EU free trade agreements. So common commercial policy, as I said earlier, is an exclusive competence of the EU since 2009. It's taken up in Article 3 of the Treaty on the European Union. And it basically says that the EU can conclude trade agreements with third states. However, often these are mixed agreements because not all issues covered in these agreements would only fall under common commercial policy, but they might also fall, for instance, under energy policy or under policies that would be shared competences between the EU and the member states. So there you would have mixed agreements where both the member states and the union are separate signatories. What does the EU do with regard to sustainable development and energy in its free trade agreements? So you would see three types of chapters that are relevant for energy and the environment specifically, and they all overlap to a certain degree. So first of all, the EU has, as a standard, started concluding trade and sustainable development chapters in its free trade agreements. It first included this in the EU-South Korea free trade agreement, but from now on they are a standard included in every trade agreement. I will explain what they exactly do and what it exactly means. Then you have very progressive chapters on the promotion of renewable energy trade and investment, which of course overlaps with the trade and sustainable development goals. And then you have the die-hard energy security and access to fossil fuels chapters. So they're there, of course, as well, because as I said, I would say there's a cognitive dissonance, or at least a conflict or a balance that the EU has to maintain at all times, being very pro-renewables and complying with the Paris Agreement on the one hand, but ensuring there's energy security and enough fossil fuels coming in on the other. So the trade and sustainable development chapters are standard in Europe's free trade agreements since the EU-Korea, South Korea, FTA. Basically, what do they contain? They contain provisions on compliance with multilateral environment agreements, so ensuring trade policy and trade relations happen in light of multilateral environmental agreements. They also include provisions on labor standards, and they are based on international labor organization conventions. And they focus on the sustainable management of natural resources. Now, I know what you're thinking right away when you hear this. This sounds kind of soft law-ish. It sounds kind of, where are the hard obligations in this? The EU is trying to step it up because they have made it binding, and they have even included a dispute settlement clause for these chapters in these agreements, and to see how countries are doing in following up with these commitments. I'm very curious to see how this will develop in the future. But I do think the EU was really trying to ensure that there is some binding element in it and that, standards are being lived up to. Now, the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement is a good example of one of the more progressive renewable energy generation chapters that we find in free trade agreements of the EU. Chapter 7 of the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement is called Non-Tariff Barriers to Trade and Investment in Renewable Energy Generation. And it has a strong renewable energy, sustainable development and climate mitigation focus. So it does try to ensure that trade and investment in these sectors happens without any barriers and that it's incentivized and promoted between the parties involved. And moreover, it's focused at actually diversifying away from fossil fuels. So here it says, the parties share the objective of promoting, developing, and increasing the generation of energy from renewable and sustainable non-fossil fuels. So you can say that this chapter 7 is quite a progressive chapter with regard to the promotion of renewable energy and trade and investment in renewable energy and removing trade barriers in that sector with third countries. If it was also nice, then it would be great, but of course that's not the whole story. Because if you look, for instance, at the very controversial EU-Ukraine Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement in Chapter 11, that is a very different type of chapter, focused die-hard on guaranteeing fossil fuel supply to Europe. Now, for those of you who don't know, the EU-Ukraine Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement was part of the larger association agreement between Ukraine and the EU, and it was actually at the heart of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Why? Because Russia has its own project called the Eurasian Economic Union, which is kind of mirroring a bit the EU, but then with the former, with the Commonwealth of Independent States, so the former Soviet Union countries. They are trying to set up a customs union of their own. And they wanted Ukraine to join. The problem is that you can't be part of more than 2 customs unions because customs unions have one common external tariff. So if you're part of the EU DCFTA, an association agreement, you would have to have one common tariff. But if you're part of the Eurasian Economic Union, you would have to have another common tariff. So that would conflict. So back in 2013, 2014, Ukraine was still willing to join the EU association agreement, but then back then ousted President Viktor Yanukovych from one day to the next decided to switch to the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. And this led to all these protests, and this led, of course, to the annexation of the Crimea and everything that followed. Nevertheless, as it stands now, Ukraine and the EU have concluded this agreement, and the Chapter 11 of the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement with Ukraine is focused on energy security and access to fossil fuels. Of course, the EU has been very worried about gas disruptions from Russia through Ukraine, and therefore it wants to guarantee that there is no interruption of energy flows. So for instance, it has argued that it has agreed with Ukraine that there has to be an elimination of dual energy pricing. So what is dual energy pricing in energy? It basically means that energy producing countries sell their energy at much higher prices abroad and will sell to domestic consumers at below market prices, kind of subsidizing the internal market. So the EU has guaranteed that this is taken up so that there is no discriminatory prices in energy trade, and also it has committed to strict transit rules so that there cannot be an interruption of transit flows of gas from Russia to the EU. And there is even more to try and guarantee the prevention of disruption. So it's very much a chapter focused on ensuring that energy relations with transit countries are good. Now, these are now dormant, obviously, and maybe unnecessary right now because, well, Juncker and Trump made their own agreement very recently. But during the EU-US transatlantic trade and investment partnership negotiations that were still taking place before Trump came into power, the EU was very much pushing for a draft chapter on energy and raw materials to be included in that trade agreement. Of course, the focus again being energy security and fossil fuels and diversifying away from Russia. Also, again, eliminating export restrictions, so ensuring that it would get fossil fuels at favorable prices and not at dual pricing, higher prices than domestic consumers would get them. And in fact, they wanted to include a specific provision on access to shale gas supplies, which of course wouldn't fly as a hard obligation, I assume. But it basically, the EU wanted to have included that parties must agree on a legally binding commitment to eliminate all existing restrictions on the export of natural gas in trade between them as of the date of the entry into force of the agreement. So basically, no discrimination, we want access to your gas supplies. And actually, that's more or less where we're at now, although it's not in any agreement at the moment. That is where the EU is going. So basically, is there a cognitive dissonance here? You can see that external policy of the EU with regards to fossil fuels and renewable energy is very much a reflection of its internal policy and the divisions therein and the tightrope EU has to walk between ensuring that they are going towards a sustainable future, but also guaranteeing the energy security of supply of their citizens. So short term, the rationale is understandable. We cannot have fossil fuel supplies and seize from one day to the next to the EU. But if you look at the long term, of course, it is problematic, and we will have to move away from such huge fossil fuel dependence in the EU. So one of these days I will quit. Let's hope that really happens. Thank you very much for your attention. I very much look forward to discussing this with you, and thanks for coming. Yes.
How has this contributed to helping the daily consumer, for instance, in Germany? Because I do know the average, let's say, liter per gallon of petroleum is close to $1.48, $1.50 euro. So that equates to $5.50 American for a gallon. How
So I would say that hasn't necessarily. So there's a lot of fossil fuel subsidies in the EU, and I would say they don't benefit the consumer. What has benefited the consumer is the gradual breakup of the European energy sector, so the introduction of unbundling. So the whole idea there is to break up the sector in line with competition law, and competition law is inherently consumer focused. So that's where the EU does try to be very active in ensuring that there's competition on the market, and ensuring now with the clean energy package that, for instance, prosumers can also participate in the market so that it's easier for them to switch, for instance. But it's on the micro level very difficult, I think, to determine how exactly this would affect your average EU consumer.
So, sorry, just like follow up. So what you're saying is that the EU, they negotiate with other delegation, other nations on behalf of companies or the people?
That's a very good question. So one of the huge criticisms of TTIP was actually, indeed, so TTIP negotiations that are still ongoing, that those were intransparent, and it was largely big companies sitting at the table, and that there was not enough transparency and not enough consumers and civil society at the table. So I would say that is definitely a problem in the sense that in these negotiations it will be big lobby groups that will try to influence the EU in its policy making, and the EU should be more transparent in opening up these types of negotiations. Yeah. Yes.
I have a comment on your the difference between cognitive dissonance and balance. You use both terms, but cognitive dissonance suggests that a stronger conflict than the need to balance
Yeah.
policies. I want to ask you, let's say you're right, it was cognitive dissonance. Clearly on one side, the EU is importing massive amounts, by any measure, of fossil fuels from Russia. There would be a cognitive dissonance if it had an internal, very ambitious renewable energy or climate policy. And I think you did describe it a couple of times as ambitious. I'm intrigued to know, how do you reach the conclusion that the EU's policy on renewables, its climate package, is ambitious?
So why it's ambitious? I would say it's definitely more ambitious with regard to its renewable energy policy than maybe other states or continents. Of course, there are some considerations, so it's maybe not so easy to roll out huge renewable energy plants such as you can do in China because, well, democracy. So let's be honest, that does play a role. But I would say it is ambitious in the sense that it sets very high mandatory targets on the union level. And so renewable energy targets in Europe were actually a preserve of the member states, but have now become EU-wide binding targets. And I think they're quite far-reaching in what they demand from member states. So member states had first the 2020 and now 2030 targets that they had to reach. I didn't include a graph, but I showed my students so what type of targets they had to have. And I think the union is very active in that. So what they did, for instance, for 2020 is that there was an overall objective to have 20% of renewables in general energy production. And they looked at all the member states separately, and they looked at where they were at in 2010 and how much they could realistically reach by 2020. And they do follow up, so it is important that you do meet those targets. So I do think they are kind of ambitious, and they do even themselves say that they want to be the front runner. So, yeah.
So just follow up. So your definition of EU ambition has a comparative element with other countries outside the EU, but also an internal component.
Yes.
Of checking how much they can realistically do.
Yes. So, and they can also start. They could start infringement procedures, for instance, if EU member states wouldn't comply. So if EU member state refused to comply with the targets, the EU can say, well, we want you to follow up. So I think there is like a legal mechanism that tries to at least ensure that EU member states do live up to what they have agreed to, basically. So and under the Paris Agreement, the fact that they have submitted an EU-wide nationally determined contribution, I do think goes in the right direction in the sense that it's trying to be a more centralized approach rather than leaving it up to the member states. So I do think they are very proactive in trying to come up with a coherent strategy. So compared to maybe, I don't know what the US is doing on a federal level, but with regard to maybe some other countries and what they do on federal level, I would say there's a very active strategy to become the front runner. So it's, if you Google Renewable Energy Europe, the EU itself will at least it will proclaim itself the front runner. Whether it's reality always or not, that's something else. Yes.
I wonder if you could speak a little more about dispute resolution in trade agreements. You spoke about sustainability standards.
Yes.
Sort of in the same breath, talking about dispute resolution.
Yes.
So I was trying to figure out who would bring such proceedings, who would have standing to bring such proceedings.
So this would be a dispute resolution within the chapter, so you can look it up. So it would be between the EU and the member states that are signing the agreement with. And of course, it would usually be the EU that would maybe try and settle a dispute with the country they signed the agreement with.
State-to-state dispute?
Yes, it would be a state-to-state.
Not private party.
No. This is all state-to-state. So unless there is investment protection. So it would be, if it's investment protection, it would be in the investor against the state, but this would be state-to-state. So of course, enforcement would be difficult here. So that would be the weakness of the system. In general, it's actually interesting to see that this would be a free trade agreement that is not concluded under the World Trade Organization. So it's a kind of a bilateral or multilateral trade agreement that is not directly regulated by the WTO. It's not regulated by the WTO. And you see much less dispute resolution in these types of trade agreements, state to state, than you would see under the WTO. So generally, if there's any trade dispute, parties do tend to go to the World Trade Organization rather than to litigate under FTAs. I have a colleague who wrote on that, why that is the case, but that's kind of interesting to note. In general, that there is less dispute settlement between states under separate free trade agreements.
But from the point of view of environmental NGOs, for example, this type of dispute settlement process adopted in Europe is just as inhospitable as dispute resolution included in the U.S. trade agreements.
Yes, it is. So yeah, I have to be realistic about that. Yeah, that's definitely the case. So it's good that they included it, but I'm curious to see, because these are quite new, so I'm curious how that will play out and whether there'll actually be any meaningful litigation under this. Yes?
Do you think part of the disconnect comes from the fact that the goals are maybe too ambitious for some countries? Like for some of them aren't going to reach their goal in 2020, and it's not that they weren't complying, so I don't think the EU bring proceedings against them because they were trying, but like they're more dependent on fossil fuels. And so if you set the same type of goal for 2030 or even a bigger, more ambitious one, like is that where some of the disconnect occurs then? Because some of their goals are too big for like the smaller countries that are too dependent on it and then need help weaning off of fossil fuels?
Yes, I would say that was definitely the problem with the 2020 targets, but the Commission tried to take that into account, so they wouldn't set very high targets. So it was an overall EU target, and then they tried to distribute how every member state can contribute realistically. Yeah, so definitely the problem is, as you saw also on the graph on energy dependency, for instance, on Russia, the reality is that a lot of member states are heavily dependent still, first of all, on fossil fuels and on imports for Russia. So you have to work with what's realistic, and the reality is we need that gas and we need fossil fuels at the moment, but we have to work towards these targets. So that's when you saw that there's different member states, basically, for instance, Malta had 0 renewable energy and therefore it got a target of only 10% to reach in 2020, while other member states have a lot of natural resources, such as the Nordics with hydro, so for them it's very easy to meet those targets. So the EU does try to take that into account in formulating these policies, definitely. And that's indeed also the reality that, yeah, we are dependent heavily. And Russia is not moving anywhere. So that's just the reality as well. Yes?
We use the word prosumer a lot. I don't know if everyone in this room knows what it is, because
Okay.
I sure did it before we started
Okay.
the class.
So in Europe, you hear a lot about the prosumer, and the prosumer is basically your household consumer that also produces energy and wants to feed it back into the grid. So that terminology is generally used in Europe for if you, have solar panels or so on, and you want to produce energy, but you also consume energy, but you're not an industrial producer. I don't know whether that term is used here a lot, but in Europe we talk about the prosumer. Well, producer, consumer. Maybe you'll start using it too. Yes.
How do these things like resonating between the DLS movement in France and
Mhm.
how there's huge politically it's a very toxic thing to increase the fuel tax, and you see protests all over France of people who are don't really care about 20
Mhm.
global France, and you see huge movements across it, not just in France, that are trying to not have the burden placed upon the consumer. And so I wonder how
Yeah,
that
but I think that's very understandable. Why? I mean, it's the energy companies that should pay any of these taxes and additional, or big industries. They should be paying the taxes. Why should it be the person that's struggling to make the next month's paycheck and so on? So I understand where that comes from, and especially if it's a country like France, where I would say the social divisions are quite large. So I do understand where that outrage comes from, and they're basically saying, well, we're not responsible. I need my fuel for my car. So it's highly problematic. But for instance, Shell doesn't pay taxes in the Netherlands. How is that okay? Yeah. So that's some things we have to look at. Of course, well, it's a Dutch-British company, and we want it to stay in the Netherlands and so on. But yeah, that is not okay. That's a fossil fuel subsidy, basically. So we have to get rid of those. We have to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies and not have consumers pay the burden for that. I mean, it's easier said than done. But that's where that rage comes from, I would say. It's often like that, right? Yes? Oh, yeah?
I get how the trade agreements affect fossil fuels, they're clear. I understood you to say that trade agreements address generation, investment in renewables as well.
Mhm.
I have sort of a harder time thinking about how renewable energy sector intersects with trade.
How it intersects with trade? Well, think about the supply of generating equipment, for instance. Just to name something. So, windmills that are produced in the Netherlands being traded to Singapore, just to name something. You know, so it's also the equipment. It's broad ranging. So that would be kind of your first example that comes to mind. Everything affects trade in this world.
And green energy, green electricity.
It can be traded across grids, of course. It depends. But if you have local content requirements in Singapore saying, well, you can, join our feed-in tariff scheme if you produce energy here, or you get a special cut if you produce it here, or if you produce your equipment here, that's illegal under international trade law. You cannot do that. Again, that's problematic, though, because you can also argue that local and renewable energy needs certain types of local content requirements, that it's often dependent on the location where it's produced. So there you would have a potential conflict with trade law and the disciplines of trade law with regard to renewable energy generation. Yes?
The other protest movement, the one in Germany against coal mines,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that is any way can partially explain the increase in reliance on Russian gas?
Sure, because gas is still cleaner than coal, right? So it's seen as a move away towards a cleaner fossil fuel. Gas is the cleanest of the fossil fuels. So it's the same in the Netherlands. We are the biggest the Netherlands is the biggest gas producer in Europe. And not often have we been told, oh, it's dirty or it has a lot of CO2. I think generally that's seen as like a clean fossil fuel. So yeah, of course. better gas than coal. But I mean, Holland has, for instance, opened up coal power plants recently. It's also scandalous, but permits were allowed or given for those 10 years back. So yeah, so I think I can definitely understand, on the one hand, where Germany is coming from. But yeah. Yes.
As domestic coal consumption in the United States decreases, there's great concern that now that we're not using it internally, we're just going to start exporting it to other continents and
Mm-hmm.
the EU. In your class, you offered a chart that suggested that coal imports have doubled since 1995. For me, that raised the cognitive dissonance. Can you offer any information or offer any insight into how environmentalists or member states are addressing coal imports into the EU, and if there's any movement towards limiting those imports?
I don't exactly know, so I won't be able to tell you exactly, but I'm sure there is a lot of opposition. It's not only coal, but I can also, for instance, give you a nice cognitive dissonance example of biomass. So, for instance, there are countries in the EU that actually burn US forests because it counts as biomass and therefore would meet renewable energy targets. So there are forests, I think, in the southern United States that are being cut down, transported to Europe, and burned for energy in Europe, and that would be seen as kind of clean energy because it's biomass. So that would be a comparable example. Well, not comparable in the sense, but there it's even worse because it's seen as something clean, but it isn't. But yeah, I would say that, of course, there's opposition to it. I can't tell you the details about the coal industry in Europe. I'd have to look into it. But yeah.
Okay, we should wrap up there. Thanks so much, Professor.
You're welcome. Thank you.